Kevin Warsh is about to become the Federal Reserve Chair, and most of the XRP community is not prepared for what that means. His confirmation hearing is this week, Senate Banking Committee focused. Narrow window for a Friday vote. Trump wants confirmation by mid-May. And once Warsh takes the Fed chair, the entire monetary policy trajectory that has been compressing risk assets for 2 years is likely to shift in ways that benefit every single thesis we've been tracking for XRP. This is not a minor administrative change. The Fed chair is arguably the single most powerful economic policy position on Earth. The person holding that job controls the interest rate decisions that determine the cost of capital globally, the balance sheet policy that determines how much liquidity exists in the financial system, and the regulatory guidance that shapes how banks engage with digital assets. Jerome Powell's era was defined by aggressive rate hikes to combat inflation, followed by a cautious holding pattern while the Fed waited for clear evidence that inflation was defeated. That caution has maintained elevated interest rates longer than the economy required, extending the macro compression that has weighed on every risk asset, including XRP. Kevin Warsh is a different policymaker with different views, and his views align with conditions that historically produce the kind of macro environment where crypto assets with institutional infrastructure thrive. Today, I'm going to walk you through who Kevin Warsh actually is, what his documented policy positions imply for interest rates and liquidity, why his Fed chairmanship specifically benefits XRP's positioning, how his crypto-aware portfolio and institutional background create favorable regulatory dynamics, and what the next 8 weeks of confirmation and first meeting decisions could mean for the price trajectory we're tracking. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why Warsh's confirmation is the macro catalyst that converges with the Clarity Act, the ceasefire, the ETF inflows, and the institutional build-out into the most complete convergence of forward positive forces XRP has ever experienced. This is not financial advice. I am sharing publicly available information for educational purposes. Always do your own research. Before we get into it, drop Warsh in the comments if you've been tracking his nomination and understand what a Fed chair change means for risk assets. Drop new if this is your first time considering the Fed chair question as a crypto catalyst. Drop skeptical if you think the Fed chair doesn't matter as much as I'm framing it, because the Fed chair question is the single most important macro variable for crypto over the next 12 months, and the community needs to be calibrated on it. Welcome back. I am the Calm Analyst. Around here, we connect macro policy decisions to crypto positioning. Today, we're breaking down Kevin Warsh's background, his policy framework, his crypto exposure, his stated positions on Fed independence and inflation, and why his confirmation creates a macro tailwind that amplifies every XRP-specific catalyst already in motion. Let's get into it. Let me start with who Kevin Warsh actually is, because understanding his background is the prerequisite for interpreting his likely policy direction. Kevin Warsh served as a Federal Reserve governor from 2006 to 2011. That means he was inside the Fed during the 2008 financial crisis, one of the most consequential monetary policy periods in American history. He was part of the committee that made the decisions about quantitative easing, the emergency lending facilities, and the interest rate policies that defined the post-crisis recovery. Before that, he served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush on economic policy. He's held senior positions at Morgan Stanley in mergers and acquisitions. He's lectured at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. His resume is classic establishment economic policy with experience across government, academia, and Wall Street. What distinguishes Warsh from many potential Fed chair candidates is his documented crypto awareness. Multiple reports have noted that his personal portfolio includes crypto exposure. He has publicly discussed digital assets in ways that suggest genuine understanding rather than dismissive skepticism. He has not made the public statements of hostility to crypto that some other Fed officials have made. This matters because a Fed chair's attitude toward digital assets shapes the regulatory environment in ways that extend beyond interest rate decisions. The Fed regulates banks. Bank regulations determine how banks can engage with crypto custody, stablecoins, tokenized securities, and blockchain settlement infrastructure. A Fed chair who understands and engages with digital assets creates very different regulatory conditions than a Fed chair who views them with suspicion. And here is where Warsh's confirmation intersects specifically with XRP's thesis. The infrastructure that Ripple has built, the SWIFT certification, the $13 trillion Treasury pipeline, the BNY Mellon custody partnership, the FDIC tokenized deposit framework, the OCC National Trust Bank Charter, all of these operate within a regulatory environment that the Fed has significant influence over. A crypto-aware Fed chair maintains and extends the favorable regulatory conditions that have been building over the last 18 months. A hostile Fed chair could reverse them. Warsh is solidly in the former category. His confirmation preserves and potentially expands the regulatory environment that XRP's institutional infrastructure depends on. If the significance of a crypto-aware Fed chair just landed differently than abstract macro commentary, smash that like button, because this is the direct link between Federal Reserve leadership and XRP's institutional positioning that most crypto analysis ignores. Now let me walk through Warsh's policy framework, because his documented positions imply specific directions for interest rates and liquidity. Warsh has publicly described inflation as a choice that the Fed must take responsibility for. That statement is significant. It positions Warsh as believing the Fed has tools to actively control inflation rather than just reacting to it. It also suggests he views the current elevated interest rate policy as necessary to address inflation rather than as a permanent condition. He has emphasized monetary policy independence and Fed independence, meaning the Fed should make policy decisions based on economic conditions rather than political pressure. This positions him as willing to resist political pressure in either direction. Trump wants rate cuts. Warsh won't cut rates because Trump wants them. But Warsh also won't hold rates elevated to spite Trump. He'll make decisions based on the data, and the data increasingly supports rate cuts. US PPI came in at 4% versus expectations of 4.6%, a significant miss to the downside that signals cooling wholesale inflation. The Iran negotiations are advancing, which, if resolved, would bring oil prices down and further reduce inflationary pressure. Global growth has been slowing, which historically creates space for rate cuts without risking inflation spirals. A data-driven Warsh responding to cooling inflation and slowing growth is a Warsh who cuts rates faster than Powell would have. Not because Warsh is dovish, because the data supports cuts, and Warsh is willing to act on it rather than wait for overwhelming confirmation. The market is pricing this. Interest rate futures have begun pricing more aggressive cuts for 2026 since Warsh's nomination gained momentum. The probability of multiple cuts by year-end has increased, and rate cut expectations are the single most powerful catalyst for risk asset rallies in modern financial history. Comment below. How many rate cuts do you expect from the Fed by end of 2026 if Warsh is confirmed? Type 1 if you think 1 cut. Type 2 if you think 2 cuts. Type 3 plus if you think aggressive cutting begins. Type 0 if you think no cuts happen. Because the number of cuts directly affects how much liquidity flows into risk assets and how much that flow benefits XRP specifically. Now let me connect rate cuts to XRP's specific positioning, because the transmission mechanism matters. When interest rates drop, the opportunity cost of holding risk assets decreases. Every dollar of capital that was earning 4.5% risk-free in Treasury bills starts looking for higher returns as Treasury yields fall. That capital rotates into equities, bonds of longer duration, commodities, real estate, and crypto. Crypto, as the highest beta asset class, captures a disproportionate share of that rotation. When rates dropped in 2020 and 2021, crypto exploded. Bitcoin went from $10,000 to $69,000. XRP went from $0.20 to over $160. The liquidity expansion produced the fastest wealth creation in crypto's history. The current setup is similar in structure, but amplified by the infrastructure build-out. In 2020, crypto was still primarily retail-driven. The institutional infrastructure was minimal. ETFs didn't exist. Bank custody was undeveloped. Wealth management platforms didn't support crypto allocations. Today, the institutional infrastructure is largely complete. 7 XRP ETFs with $1 billion in AUM. Morgan Stanley Wealth Management approval. BNY Mellon custody. BlackRock integration through RLUSD. Swift certification for Ripple Treasury. Multiple CBDCs on XRP ledger infrastructure. Natixis Institutional Research Classification. The full build-out is ready to absorb institutional capital the moment that capital starts rotating. Rate cuts trigger the rotation. Infrastructure captures it. That's the convergence that Warsh's confirmation enables. And the timing aligns with every other catalyst we've been tracking. The Clarity Act approaches markup in late April. ETF inflows are at record April pace. Rakuten just onboarded 44 million users. The Iran negotiations are advancing. The PPI data supports imminent rate cut probability. Warsh's confirmation hearing is this week. Every independent variable is pointing in the same direction at the same time. That is not how macro environments normally behave. Usually something is working against you while something else is working for you. When all variables align simultaneously, the resulting capital flows are larger and faster than any single variable would produce. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, drop it in the comments. Because the convergence of Warsh's confirmation with the other macro and XRP specific catalysts creates the most complete bullish setup this asset has ever experienced, and the community needs real-time coverage as each piece activates. Now let me address the independence question, because this is where Warsh's framework differs from what political commentators are saying. Trump wants rate cuts. Trump nominated Warsh. Political logic would suggest that Warsh will deliver rate cuts because that's what Trump wants. Warsh has specifically pushed back against this framing. He has publicly committed to Fed independence. He has said the Fed's decisions will be based on monetary policy analysis rather than political pressure. He has indicated he will resist presidential lobbying for specific rate decisions. For markets, this is actually more bullish than a politically dependent Fed chair. A Fed chair who cuts rates because the president tells them to creates instability, because markets can't forecast policy based on economic data. A Fed chair who cuts rates because the data supports cuts creates predictability because economic indicators reliably signal policy direction. Warsh's commitment to independence means that when rates drop under his tenure, markets will read the cuts as economically warranted rather than politically forced. Economically warranted cuts are sustainable. Politically forced cuts often get reversed when political conditions change or when the economic consequences appear. Sustainable rate cuts produce sustained bull markets. Forced cuts produce volatile rallies followed by painful reversals. This distinction matters for position sizing and time horizon. If you believe Warsh will cut rates for economic reasons, you can hold through the cuts with confidence that the policy direction is stable. If you believed Warsh would cut rates for political reasons, you'd need to be more cautious about the sustainability of any rally. Warsh's explicit commitment to independence is itself a bullish signal, because it tells markets that whatever policy changes occur will be based on economic reality rather than political whim. That stability is what institutional capital requires to deploy at scale. Now let me connect Warsh's framework to the bank regulation dimension, because this is the piece that directly affects XRP's infrastructure. The Fed chair has significant influence over bank regulatory policy. The Fed supervises large bank holding companies. The Fed participates in the interagency regulatory framework that shapes how banks can engage with crypto. The Fed's guidance on digital asset activities has historically been more conservative than the OCC's or the FDIC's. Warsh's documented crypto awareness suggests he will bring a more engaged approach to bank crypto regulation. That likely means clearer frameworks for bank stablecoin issuance, more permissive guidance on bank custody of digital assets, better integration between traditional banking and blockchain infrastructure, and potentially faster approval processes for bank engagement with tokenized securities. All of these regulatory directions directly benefit XRP's institutional infrastructure. Ripple Treasury's corporate clients need bank partners to actually execute payments on chain. Banks need regulatory clarity to participate confidently. A Fed chair who creates that clarity accelerates the $13 trillion pipeline conversion from 0% on-chain to meaningful institutional volume. The OCC has already provided favorable digital asset rulings. The FDIC has ruled tokenized deposits equal bank deposits. The SEC has classified XRP as a commodity. The final piece of the regulatory puzzle is Fed engagement with bank digital asset activities. Warsh is positioned to provide that engagement in ways Powell did not emphasize. Let me bring this all together, because the picture that emerges from combining Warsh's confirmation with the other variables is the most complete bullish setup XRP has ever experienced. Kevin Warsh confirmed as Fed chair by mid-May. Independent monetary policy focused on inflation reduction while supporting economic growth. Rate cuts beginning in Q3 2026 as inflation data continues to cool. Bank regulatory framework expanding engagement with digital assets. Fed guidance supporting the tokenization infrastructure that XRP underlies. Simultaneously, the Clarity Act passes in late April or May. The commodity classification becomes permanent federal law. 7 ETFs see accelerated inflows. Morgan Stanley's 15,000 financial advisors begin client conversations. Rakuten's 44 million users adopt XRP payments. The BlackRock threshold is crossed. Ripple Treasury's corporate clients begin on-chain migration. On the macro side, Iran negotiations resolve toward a deal. Oil drops under $90. Global growth stabilizes. Rate cut expectations accelerate. Capital rotates from bonds and money markets into risk assets. The liquidity expansion flows into crypto. Bitcoin sets new highs. XRP's 1.5 to 2.0x beta captures the rotation, and the infrastructure that's been built during the boring period converts. Swift certification produces bank flow volume. CBDC deployments expand, AI agent transactions scale on the XRP ledger. Tokenized assets settle through the securitized RLUSD integration. The $16 trillion tokenization wave begins materializing. Each of these variables moving independently is a meaningful catalyst. All of them moving simultaneously is a regime change. And the regime change we're about to experience is structurally different from any previous XRP cycle because the infrastructure supporting it is more complete than it has ever been. The people who understood this setup early are positioned for what follows. The people who waited for every variable to confirm before deploying will arrive to a repriced market where the asymmetry has already closed. Price is a distraction. Value is the reality. Structure is what matters. And the structure that Warsh's confirmation catalyzes, a macro environment of declining rates, expanding liquidity, favorable bank regulation, and sustained institutional adoption, is the environment that every part of XRP's thesis has been waiting for. The thesis doesn't work in isolation. It works when the macro cooperates, and the macro is about to start cooperating across every dimension simultaneously. In a market fueled by emotion and noise, we thrive on data and composure. Remember, haste leads to loss, while calm analysis leads to victory. Comment, calm analyst below, and tell me honestly, how much does the Fed chair matter in your crypto positioning framework? Type huge if you think it's a primary variable. Type moderate if you think it matters but isn't dominant. Type minor if you think crypto is disconnected from Fed policy. Because how you weight macro variables determines how you interpret every catalyst we've been tracking. Like, subscribe, notifications on. I'll see you in the next one. Stay patient, stay rational. And as we always do, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it. Peace.